inside job, and you can get a look at it. I would urge you to do so. These reports and other historical evidence prove beyond any doubt that much of Wall Street is rotten to the core. It has become one gigantic millstone around the neck of both the American and world economies. The collateral damage from the recent meltdown has been staggering. The U.S. Bureau of Labor estimated that 8.4 million jobs were lost in the U.S. alone. Most countries experience similar dramatic losses. The reduction in asset values worldwide has been estimated at 20 trillion US dollars. Yet not a single one of the culprits is in jail. You would think that someone would have had the decency to launch a class action for at least 10 trillion against every individual and every organization that contributed to the catastrophe in any way. It boggles the mind that a system so vulnerable to manipulation would ever have come into existence in the first place. Well, as you might expect, the evolution did not happen by accident. It was not guided by the mythical, invisible hand of Adam Smith. On the contrary, for more than a century and a half, it was engineered by the barely visible hand of the Rothschild family and its allies. And since World War II, by the Rockefeller family. The two dynasties combined forces to exercise influence on many fronts, sheltered by the cloak of secrecy established by the Bilderberg Group. The long-term influence of the banking cartel is incalculable. Their biggest coup was the establishment of the Federal Reserve System in the United States. The big New York banks really didn't like the idea of genuine competition. So a small group held a secret meeting at the private resort of J.P. Morgan on Jekyll Island, off the coast of Georgia. Their scheme, devised by Paul M. Warburg and subsequently adopted by Congress, is a legal private monopoly of the U.S. money supply, operated for the benefit of the few under the guise of protecting and promoting the public interest. It is a tribute to the skill of the international bankers that they were able to draft a bill, revise it, change its name, and make the few window-dressing compromises necessary to get it adopted by Congress just before Christmas, when quite a few representatives must have been dreaming of sugar plum fairies instead of exercising due diligence. Only Charles Lindbergh Sr. seemed to grasp the significance of what was going on. To put it bluntly, the Congress transferred its sovereign constitutional right to create money to the sole custody of a group of private bankers. The magnitude of the hoist is unprecedented in the history of the world. The numbers now are in the high trillions. Soon after the bill was passed, the magnitude of the tragedy began to be recognized. Williams Jennings Bryan, who acted as Democrat whip, later said, and I quote him, "In my long political career, the one thing I genuinely regret is my part in getting the banking and currency legislation, that's the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, enacted into law." End of quote. President Woodrow Wilson, just 3 years after passage of the act, wrote, and I quote him, "A great industrial nation is controlled by its system of credit. Our system of credit is concentrated in the Federal Reserve System. The growth of the nation, therefore, and all of our activities are in the hands of a few men. We have come to be one of the worst ruled, one of the most completely controlled and dominated governments in the civilized world." But the bill was not repealed. almost 100 years later, the sellout is still the law. This makes you wonder what the people's representatives have been doing to earn their salaries. The people in charge of the original deception were very far-seeing. They realized that when future governments had to borrow from them, they would need a constant stream of income to pay the interest on the bonds. So they pursued the government to introduce income taxes, first as temporary measures, but later permanently, so that it would be possible for the government to meet its obligations to the bondholders. In fiscal year 2005, total individual income taxes in the U.S. totaled $927 billion. Of that amount, $352 billion, or 38%, was required just to pay interest on the federal debt. The figure would be much higher now. The banksters, as they were often called at the time, then decided that an independent press might catch on to the chicanery. Oscar Callaway is reported in the Congressional Record of February the 9th, 1917, as follows, and I quote, "In March 1915, the J.P. Morgan interests, the steel, shipbuilding, and powder interests and their subsidiary organizations got together 12 men high up in the newspaper world and employed them to select the most influential newspapers in the United States, and sufficient number of them to control generally the policy of the daily press of the United States. They found it was only necessary to purchase the control of 25 of the greatest papers. The 25 papers were agreed upon. Emissaries were sent to purchase the policy, national and international, of these papers. An editor was furnished for each paper to properly supervise and edit information regarding the questions of preparedness, militarism, financial policies, and other things of national and international nature, the ones that were considered vital to the interests of the purchasers, and in brackets, and to suppress everything in opposition to the wishes of the interests served," end of quote. It has been suggested that the Bilderberger Group may have taken a leaf from the Morgan precedent to protect their interests in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. That is impossible to prove because its members are sworn to secrecy and the press won't report on its meetings. Could it be mere coincidence that the monetary system, the downside of globalization, and the decades-long cover-up of the extraterrestrial presence and technology, especially the clean energy sources that would impact the value of oil stocks, the three subjects most directly beneficial interests to the banksters, are the three subjects that the mainline press have avoided like the plague. Well, I'm not willing to go so far as to say that the men behind the international banking system are evil men because their thoughts are private. But Sir Josiah, later Baron Stamp, a former director of the Bank of England, has given us a rare snapshot of the truth. Banking, he said, and I'm quoting him, was conceived in iniquity and was born in sin. The bankers own the earth. Take it away from them, but leave them the power to create money. And with a flick of a pen, they will create enough money to buy it back again. However, take that power away from them, and all the great fortunes like mine will disappear. And they ought to disappear, for the world would be a happier and better place to live in. But if you wish to remain the slaves of bankers and pay the cost of your own slavery, let them control and continue to create money. When the latest meltdown of 2007-2008, the Fed acted quickly to prevent the Ponzi pyramid from collapsing completely. It printed trillions of dollars to bail out the banks and a few industries that were highly indebted to the banks. But what did the Fed do for the taxpayers, whose money was so wildly diluted to save the banks? Nothing. They were left to fend for themselves. Millions of people lost their jobs, their farms, their houses, their hopes, and their dignity, all as a result of circumstances beyond their control. The taxpayers bailed out the banks, but got nothing in return. The same is true of governments, who came so quickly to the rescue. As a result of the meltdown, their revenues were decreased, so they were forced to incur or increase their deficits, as well as to start cutting back on essential services, something I was reading about in this morning's New York Times. The Fed pretended to be helping stimulate the economy by reducing interest rates to near zero. It would be an interesting exercise to find out how much of that low-cost money went where. What was it spent for? It would certainly be a good subject for congressional attention. How much did the banks use to buy up domestic and foreign assets at fire sale prices? Was any of it used by financial institutions to try to corner world food markets and raise prices at a time when millions of people are starving? Well, no doubt some taxpayers did take advantage of the low interest rates, but were they warned about the old bait and switch game? Anyone who acquires assets with cheap money runs the risk of losing their property when the Fed ultimately raises rates. It's all part of the boom-bust cycle inherent in our infinitely silly monetary system. Well, what does this have to say about the economics profession? What it really says isn't fit to print. Someone said that if you put 20 economists in a room, you will get 21 opinions. That is not my experience. If you get 20 economists together, they are likely to give you one stock answer, or at most two. And if there is one dissenter, he or she is likely to be drowned out by the 19, squawking like a flock of parrots the words memorized from their professors' mouths. Well, I have witnessed the herd-like mentality firsthand. When I was first elected to the House of Commons in 1949, there were only a handful of Keynesians in Ottawa.